Welcome everyone to interview series for Actionable Intelligence Alert number 4. I have a special guest today, a gentleman named Shawn Hackett from Hackett Financial Services, or Advisors, excuse me. And Hackett Financial Advisors was started with a singular focus to help educate and inform hedgers and investors on how to go about maximizing effective decisions in agricultural commodities. President and CEO Shawn Hackett's 20-plus years of experience in the trenches in managing money has allowed him to develop a very disciplined and effective plan on how to navigate the sometimes treacherous waters of the financial world. Shawn is also a frequent contributor to articles published in Barron's, Futures Magazine, Investors Business Daily, Reuters, Bloomberg, and Minionville. So welcome to the program, Shawn Hackett. Before we get started, I just want to, that was a quick segue from your website. We'll put a link to it in the show notes, but I want to let you add on to that and kind of however you feel you would like to before we get into some what I think are some very important issues that aren't discussed around agriculture. So feel free to add to the introduction.
Yeah, the only thing I would say, John, is that what really separates us from other outfits that price forecast ag markets for farmers and speculators is that we focus on two, we think, pretty distinct disciplines. One is natural weather cycles, which is what we're going to be talking about today. We've really honed in on what they are, how to use them, and it guides a lot of our decision-making process of where we think we are in terms of prices and when they're going to be doing certain things based upon that. The other thing that we do is we've developed a proprietary smart money insiders algorithm that actually measures what we've defined as smart money that goes in and out of the ag futures markets. And we've developed an indicator that generates longer term buy signals and sell signals that we utilize in unison with these natural weather cycles to give us really good ability to provide good price forecasting for our customers. And so that's what really where we come from. And how we've been able to differentiate ourselves from our competitors and why people seek us to guide them on the future prices for agriculture.
So that's an excellent segue, and the reason I wanted to have you on is because I had learned about some of your work and listened to some podcasts you've been on and some other interviews. And a thing that I'm passionate about when it comes to agriculture, which I am passionate about, is the effect, which I believe is the various cycles that affect agriculture, whether they're weather and how they're influenced and can be influenced by various things, constituents. Now, the current zeitgeist, in society, when we talk about weather or climate or anything like that, seems to be, around man-made climate change, which I don't even want to get into. The thing that intrigues me and fascinates me, and why I wanted to have you on, was to talk about weather and the solar cycles and some of the other things that are affected by that with sea surface temperature and some of these things that I think aren't discussed. And just before I turn it over to you, the reason I don't think they're discussed, and there are historical precedents here for what we're getting ready to talk about, which I'm sure you will discuss. I like what you said in the previous interview, because no one's around for when these things happened in the past. These cycles occur regularly through the millennia. We can trace these things through various ice cores, trees, rings, all types of other things. But the thing we're going to discuss today, really a lot of people haven't experienced because nobody was alive the last time they happened. So I'll turn it over to you to talk about sunspots, the solar cycles, and some of the other things that you look into and have researched.
Well, yeah, I mean that is the hard part. You have to believe in something that no one can say, I lived through that. People said, I lived through World War II, I lived through the Depression. No one can say this is what it was like the last time we had a grand solar cycle minimum, which is what they call these long periods of lower sunspot cycles. But yet there's plenty of data and historical context and evidence that one can look and read that goes over what did take place during those periods of time. One thing we know about the sun is that it is cyclical. It will go through long periods, really 200-year periods, where it fires up normally, And then it goes through these periods of about 50 years where the sun sunspots, the solar radiation goes quiet. The understanding of how the sun operates is that there's four magnetic fields that rotate around the sun at different resonance frequencies. And as they move around, they normally are what's called constructive. They're on one side and the other side. If anyone remembers their physics course in high school or college, constructive means that they add to each other. And when you have high magnetic field strength, the sun produces sunspots. But every 200 years, these different cycles means that they get on the opposite side of the sun, north and south, and they cancel each other off, meaning the magnetic field strength of the sun gets reduced dramatically, and the sun cannot produce sunspots like it normally does when the magnetic field strength of the sun goes down. And we are clearly entered into a period where that has happened. They measure this stuff. They measure the magnetic field strength of the sun. They can tell you it's fallen dramatically in the last 10 years. So we know this is happening, and we also know that the sunspots have, in fact, been going, much down, and solar radiation is much reduced. So we are clearly, in our view, just entering in this 30 to 50-year cycle of lower sunspots, lower solar radiation. And when that happens, dramatic changes occur with our weather, not only with temperature, but with upper airflow, that dramatically alters our weather volatility. So, for example, last year we had record number of all-time highs and a record number of all-time lows in the same 12 months in the United States. Now that's weather volatility. When you get that kind of a swing in prices of weather. And so when that happens, producing food becomes much more challenging. It's either a drought or it's a flood. It's either record heat or it's record cold. There's nothing in the middle. And in anything that we've learned from agriculture over the years, John, is that agricultural needs, kind of steady, kind of consistent temperature patterns, but these wild swings, it doesn't do very well. And we've already seen some of that over the last couple of years, and we've already seen some impact to production around the world.
So that's exactly what I wanted to talk about. And I want to talk about, I want to get too scientific for most people. They can do the research, but
sure.
If we accept that, which I do, and that the sunspot activity, and people can look at the 22, 23, and 24, they were reduced amounts of sunspots, and the forecast for 25 is coming out, and people are saying, well, there's going to be similar to 24, but other folks are, depending on who you want to listen to, but we won't really know until we actually get into the cycle. But I want to key on what you said, weather volatility, because what I have read when I read various books about what they call the Little Ice Age. I don't like using that term because people kind of go the wrong way with that. But I'm talking about the Dalton minimum, the Maunder minimum times back in the late 1300s to 1600s, and then in the 1800s when people are kind of familiar when the Thames River froze in England, and people were having winter fairs, and there's lithographs showing that. But anyways, what I think is interesting, which you touched on, is I came upon a chart, and maybe you probably know this. It showed the upper growing regions of the North America, what we consider part of our grain belt, Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota, up into Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. And what I believe the chart showed me, and I want you to speak to this because I think this is what people are missing, and where we're getting into some serious discussion here. If you change the weather patterns such, or the growing season shrinks by 15, 20, 30 days, whatever, on each side of the season, or on the front end or the back end, or if you lower the average temperature for some period of time over a couple decades by even, not that much, a couple degrees Celsius, I believe is what I saw, almost you could be in a situation where various crops, like in Canada, the canola crop is in danger, that there's large areas that you currently grow in that you would not be able to sustain that same amount of agriculture. Did I read that right? Am I understanding that correctly, or am I off base there?
You're right on. There's we went back and did a study of crop yields going back to the last two grand solar cycles. You said the Maunder and the Dalton. And what we found was that during those periods, yields went flat to down over the duration of the grand solar cycle minimum because of the shortening of the growing duration. Meaning, if you plant the crop late and your first freeze in the fall comes early and you truncate the duration of the growing season, you have less heating degree days, you have less time for that crop to develop and fill out and finish out. So those to the north simply not only can they not get the yield that they're accustomed to getting when things are warmer, but the quality of the crop. So past year, we were harvesting corn that was, extremely wet, 50% moisture when it's supposed to be 15% when you're harvesting it, causes all kinds of damage, fungus, quality problems. So there's two things. It's the yield and the quality that both get impacted dramatically during these periods when the duration of the growing season shortens. And yes, large swaths of the northern tier Canadian grain belt and northern tier U.S. grain belt shrink, and what can be grown there, those yields are way down, or they simply have to grow something that has a shorter growing season, or they can use what they call shorter duration seed that will mature at a much faster rate. But the faster you mature a crop, the lower the yields are by definition. You have less time, less energy to grow the crop out. So you're exactly spot on that the biggest impact to having a shortened growing season, a longer winter season, is that you're shrinking the growing season. So for an example, in the 70s when we had a period where, if you remember back in the 70s, I do, that we were worried about global cooling back then, and we were going to have, people were predicting the ice age in the 70s because they had a cold period. We could talk about that having to do with the sea surface temperatures later on in your program if you want. But the growing season since the 70s has grown by 35 days on average. 35, the crop is 35 more days to grow now than it did back in the 70s when it was much cooler. That has an enormous impact on how much ground can get planted and how your yields can grow. We would argue that more than half of the yield growth that we've seen between the 70s and now has all to do with the lengthening of the growing season, not genetics, better farming practice. That's helped, but it's clearly been not the only factor as to how we've been growing more food per acre.
And that's exactly the question I wanted to ask you. I mean, I follow agriculture quite a bit. I don't farm myself. I've just been fascinated with it since I've been a kid, and I experienced exactly what you were saying. We talked before we started the program. I had a lot of experience in Illinois last year, and I worked with a lot of farmers because I was building wind farms on their properties in
Sure.
corn and soybean fields. And I just witnessed. I was with guys, and I learned a lot about that. Is exactly right. The further we got into the season in the wet, they couldn't get the seed in, or that some guys plowed under a couple times and replanted, and some people just threw their arms up. It was just too wet. They couldn't get the crop, and the guys that did got in late, and they were telling me how much it was going to affect their yield. And that was the question I wanted to ask you. You kind of touched on it. We have this fascination with technology in our time now. I'm fascinated with agricultural technology, GPS, being able to place inputs in specific places in the field. To your point, increased herbicides and pesticides, all these different things, all the things that we're using. But, and I think a lot of people attribute and take for granted and think that's just been all technological innovation, all these yields that we've seen increasing over time, more and more abundant and feeding the world. But it seems like we've given a lot of credit to ourselves when we should have maybe given a lot of credit that we were in happened to be in a lucky period of time when we had enhanced growing conditions. It seems, how much do you think is attributable, to that vis-a-vis the technology? Because you can't fight the weather. That's the farmer, that's what farmers are always worried about. They can do everything perfectly, and then the weather ruin them. And if we're going to go into a situation where we're going to have multi-year or possibly multi-decade times of weather volatility, that's called. I like that term because that's describes it better than just being provocative and saying we're going to go to a new ice age, because that's too provocative in my mind. But weather volatility, where you do get a crop and you think you're doing well, and then bang, the weather turns on you, you have more moisture than you need, your crop rots, or you get into too high of temperatures. I mean, as you well know, in corn, I mean, a lot of guys got bailed out because the sun did come out pretty good in that summer last year and bailed a lot of guys out because we had pretty good, decent heat coming out of there. So anyways, I was droning on a little bit, but I'd like you to speak to that a little bit. I think that's what a lot of people will say when they hear this is, well, we'll figure a way out of it. And, you know, there's other things that go into this too. Less per capita growing or productive acres. I mean, like I was talking, Lee County and DeKalb County, that's right outside Chicago, and the suburbs are even creeping out there now. So there's a lot of things going on, I think, that people aren't taking into account. And there's 50 million more people, 60 million more people every year to feed on this planet. So comment on that, I'd appreciate it.
Well, when we went back and looked back at all the last two major grand solar cycles, we saw yield double into the modern minimum and then spend 50 years going sideways to down. Then we saw yields double into the Dalton grand solar cycle minimum and then spend 50 years going flat to down. So periods of rapid yield growth is common during periods where the planet's weather is warming and we're getting longer growing periods. We're getting more ground. I mean, so it's everyone thinks that somehow doubling yields like we've done has never happened before. Of course it has. Now, it doesn't mean there's no impact. Exactly how much technology is improved it or not, I will answer the question this way. So Russia has become one of the dominant wheat exporters in the world, and they've experienced some extremely aberrant volatile weather the last couple of years. They reached a peak production of about 90 million metric tons. In the last two seasons, they've not been able to grow a crop larger than 70 million metric tons. So it's 20 million metric tons 2 years in a row. They've come up short with the same technology supposedly that can handle any and all problems. And now they're cutting back on exports because they're afraid they don't have enough supplies on hand to take care of people locally in Russia. And weather really actually hasn't been that bad yet. I mean, it's been unfavorable, but it's not really been as bad as it's going to be. Or look at Australia. Their crop production was down 75% from their wheat production was down 75% from what it was 3 or 4 years ago. Same technology, foolproof, nothing bad can happen. Of course, they had historic drought, and then you talked about how you throw immediately too much rain, just like that with the weather volatility. They had massive flooding here a month after they finished the record drought. They had historic flooding where they were doing fly fishing, in the same places that they couldn't buy a drop of rain because of this extreme weather volatility. So we've already, and look, last year's crops in the U.S. were dramatically lower than we've seen in recent years, despite all this technology. So clearly, one has to appreciate that, yes, there clearly is some technology component that is increasing yields independent of weather, but clearly way, way too much fanfare has been given to technology and far too little has been given to good weather as to the reasons why yields have been growing. And the examples we've already seen already support the view that technology is not going to save us from the kind of weather volatility that's coming if we're correct about entering this next grand solar cycle minimum, John.
So excellent. So I kind of want to move into a little bit more about talking about some other things that also affect that you have mentioned before. I mean, we talk about the sun and the solar activity, and people can research these terms like Dalton minimum, Maunder minimum. There's a lot of good books that talk about how life was during those times and the political and social. You mentioned that earlier in the conversation. These times led to severe economic, social and political changes. You can almost lay this stuff on top, and you can see, what sparked the French Revolution. Part of it was food riots. People were hungry. That was it was during the time of, of weather volatility that we're talking about. So we saw that even in the Arab Springs. I mean, a lot of the things that happened in Egypt and stuff, these people are on basically food importers, and I don't think people are giving enough thought to this. But let's talk about, we've talked a lot about the solar cycles. What about sea surface temperature volatility, La Ninas, El Ninos, and how that can now? Because what I'm trying to get to here, and I think you can take this and run with it. A lot of things are starting to come together at one time that are even going to make this maybe possibly even more extreme than if it was just a one-off of each constituent. So feel free.
There's two primary variables that move temperatures, global temperatures. One is the solar cycle, or we are in a normal, firing up normal solar cycle, or are we in a period of reduced solar cycle? The other is the sea surface temperatures of the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean. So, give you a little context. The Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean go through a cycle of 40 years of warming, 40 years of cooling, 40 years of warming. We've been doing this for hundreds and hundreds and thousands of years. And what we find is that, for example, the period from 1900 to 1940, we had the sea surface temperatures warming, and it culminated, for example, in the Dust Bowl, one of the hottest decade to this day in the United States was that 10-year period in the 30s where we had, the hottest temperatures, the greatest droughts. It was just everything was burning up, and that peaked right when the sea surface temperatures of the Atlantic and the Pacific peaked. Then those sea surface temperatures cooled from 1940 to 1980, and it went through. Now remember, the solar cycle was normal during this period, but the sea surface temperatures cooled, and we still had significant cooling temperatures to the point where we actually had a global cooling scare in the 1970s. I mean, there was actually, Times Magazine on the front cover talked about we're entering into an ice age. They didn't know what they were talking about, but that's what they were worried about at the time because it got that cold at the bottom of that cycle. Then, as we would expect, from 1980 to 2020, the Atlantic and the Pacific warmed for 4 years, which meant that we should be warming, and we have. So the sea surface temperatures, think of it as a bathtub, a hot bath versus a cold bath in a closed room. What happens to the ambient temperature? And so what's the cycle say now, John? It says that we're going to be entering a 40-year period from 2020 to 2060 where the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans are going to be cooling again. That in itself means that overall temperatures of the Earth are going to cool. But what's different this time, and you alluded to the culmination of multiple cycles, what's different this time that was not in existence in 1940, 1980, is that we are also entering a grand solar cycle. When we ran correlation studies on solar activity, sea surface temperatures of the Atlantic and the Pacific, and we went back 500 years to 1,000 years and beyond using tree ring analysis and ice core samples, we came up with an 88% correlation coefficient. That means that there was an 88% correlation between the movement of these variables and the temperature on the Earth. So we would expect the cooling in this next 50-year phase to be of a higher order significance than the one we saw between 1940 and 1980 that actually caused people to get scared, as I said in the 70s, that we were actually going to have a serious problem. So that makes this period, John, different, more serious, and more impactful to food production than the one that we went through in 1940 to 1980. And that, once again, gives me a reason to be more concerned that because people have placed too much faith in technology and not enough faith in the weather actually is the dominant factor in our ability to grow food and what land we can grow food on, that we're going to be met against a shock to the system, meaning that we're going to realize that we don't have technology yet that can produce food in this environment. It doesn't mean we can't come up with it. It doesn't mean ingenuity can't come in and figure it out, but it means we're not prepared for it. And it's going to take a long period of high prices and ingenuity to come up with a new solution than the one we've are under, which means all the technology we've been using to this date, that we have been using to grow food, that we claim is making food, increasing yield and allowing us to grow more food, has been the idea of a warming planet, and it's always going to be warming. And with that, we are going to develop seed technology that can do well with hotter, drier temperatures. That's not going to be what's going to allow food to grow in an overall increased weather volatility environment with a general cooling trend that we're likely to see. None of the technology that's been used today can handle that, and that's the shock to the system that we see coming up as we move into this next 10-year period, where everyone realizes that Mother Nature is in charge, as she always has been and always will be.
Absolutely. I kind of want to move a little bit. We've kind of set the stage here because this is actionable intelligence. So I kind of want to get into what's actionable here. And a couple charts that I've shown in my own newsletter and some of the things I've talked about is not just in all commodities and resources, but a lot, especially in agriculture. I think because of the abundance we've seen and the excellent growing seasons year after year after year, is we are at a point now, and depending on how you want to measure it, but commodities in general and agricultural prices specifically are relative to other asset classes. Shall we want to use stocks or whatever, real estate, whatever, are near not maybe all-time lows, but at really depressed levels. I think the second or third lowest they've probably been in the last 100 years or something to that effect. I can't remember, depending on what metric you want to use. And so when we look at stuff, we can say, okay, great, this makes sense, I get it, or I'm familiar with the argument, but how is it actionable? And I guess the question is what's, a catalyst, low prices don't seem to cure low prices because that seems to happen a lot, but the catalyst seems to be if we enter into, and these things are not like one-off year type things, these are decade-long situations. If we're correct in our discussion here. So, it's hard, I think, for people to, and I think you're the perfect person to ask this question to, and I'm getting to the question, I'm long-winded, but anyway, people have this fear or they look at commodities or futures or different things, and I don't know how far you want to get into this for education for people, but they look at well, you just can't do that because that's for, Archer Daniels Midland and ConAgra and Farmers Hedge, but it is an actual investment class, and it can, if it's used correctly and not as a speculative endeavor, can be used it can be actionable if you know what you're doing. Because I think people get scared off by margin and things like that. They don't understand. It's not the scope of this discussion to a futures class, but can you speak to that? I mean, people, and why I'm asking this question is because I am shocked. I knew this was a scam, but I knew it was going to happen because people don't understand like contango, backwardation, and what happened just in the last week with the oil market and people piling in, the retail piling into USO. Robin Hood, for example, that was their largest input. I was like over $1 billion went into that thing, and that thing just blew up on people. And people were like, well, how? That scares people away. So if you can, I mean, that's anecdotal, I know, but maybe you can use that as a segue into a discussion of that. This is a legitimate, actionable asset class, then we are looking at a catalyst for these historic low prices to possibly change and move upwards.
Well, we always say just because an asset is cheap doesn't mean it can't stay cheap. There has to be something that changes the reason why something is cheap. And you're correct. The metric we used, and you can use other metrics, but the metric we used was commodities against the Dow Jones Industrial Average, going back 150 years. And we found that 1929, 1969 were the only other two times that we were this cheap in terms of agriculture commodities relative to the Dow Jones Industrial Average. Anybody can look at a long-term commodity chart and knows that food did extremely well between 1929 and 1949, and did extremely well, from 1969 to 1980 and even to 1987. So when we looked at this cheap asset class, we say, okay, there's an opportunity here, but we need to have an idea of why would some of this change? Why would the dynamics change? Is there something that's coming along that's going to change? Is it going to be a change in the government system, in the subsidy system? Is it going to be a change in eating habits, or is it going to be a change in the weather? Is it a war? A lot of times wars can get food going. I mean, there's a lot of different catalysts, but all the things we looked at said to us, given the cycles we've already discussed with the sea surface temperatures of the Atlantic and the Pacific and the sun cycles, that Mother Nature was going to likely be the catalyst that was going to propel this asset class from being cheap and repricing food to having a greater value in the global asset marketplace. And so everything says to me, that count is going to be sufficient to do that, because it's going to create real shortages, and it's going to create a real change in the perception that technology is in charge instead that Mother Nature is in charge. So in terms of actionable, look, there's no question that futures and options, it is not for the layman. It's not for somebody that is going to be a passive investor. I mean, it's someone that really has to know what they're doing, and so I understand the idea of people being concerned about going down the futures and options route, because it's complicated and it's time frames and that sort of thing. But something more actionable, as you said about actionable, something more actionable that somebody can do. In my view, the first thing somebody can do is say, okay, before I go talking about futures and options or looking at an ETF for corn or an ETF for grains or an ETF for the soft ag markets or whatever, before I go there, why don't I make sure that I have my food needs met, my real food needs met, what I actually need, that if we go through a period of dysfunction, a period of shortage, a period like a pandemic, where maybe some food might not be available everywhere in the world because of the logistic problems that we might be having and such forth and so on. The thing I can do is make sure that I have my physical foods need met for a long enough period of time that I can weather the storm until the world can figure things out. I think that's probably the most actionable thing someone can do immediately, is to take action on that regard, to take greater security over their own food needs, physically food needs, is something I think is something anybody can do. It's not complicated. It doesn't require you to understand futures and options and margin and all those sort of things. It's simply taking greater control and taking a greater understanding of making sure that your family can be, food and nutrition needs can be met during a period of chaos. We've already seen how quickly chaos can occur with this virus that came out of nowhere and are causing all kinds of problems that no one could have foreseen just a couple of months ago. So
I think that's outstanding advice, actually. I'm glad that you said it like that, because I think, what happens is I was just listening to a hedge fund guy that he was on a podcast, a guy that I've known and done business with before, and he was talking about he's running out of tuna fish and beans, and this coronavirus thing kind of woke him up to the fact, hey, the supply chain is very precarious. I mean, these grocery stores, Publix or whatever, or HEB or wherever you're at in the country, Ralph's. I mean, you're talking about a 3-day turnaround here. I mean, the shelves are bare in 3 days. And I think you're exactly right. I mean, this has woken people up. These pork plants that are shutting down because the workers are all lower skilled people. Most of them are immigrants. They got coronavirus outbreaks. Now you start backing up the supply chain to the farms. We've seen where migrant labor in California and South Florida, they can't get the labor, so they're plowing things under. And you put this on top of, this is kind of your preview trailer to the big movie that is coming when we talk. So I think that was excellent advice. Obviously, there'll be opportunities as this thing goes along, as farming comes increase. Obviously, if prices go up, this thing doesn't hit the whole world in the same way everywhere. So people will take advantage. And then if you see, there'll be times to, buy nutrient stock or, Agco or whatever, or Deere. Those will be opportunities. I'm not going to speak to that now, but there'll always be opportunities. But I think you're exactly right. And I think being local, finding out local people that raise things or catch fish or local livestock, in cultivating your local farmers market, that type of stuff, I think is time and energy well spent, because from what I understand, what I've read, and I don't like I said, I don't like to be too too much hyperbole, but we have 8 billion people now on this earth, and it's increasing, 80 million, 60 to 80 million people a year. And the food situation, the carryovers and stuff like that, I watch these things and I just look at the yields and I thought to myself, the weather has just been perfect for year after year after year. What happens when it finally, even if you get a one-off, even if you don't subscribe to these views? So I think there'll be opportunities. One thing I do want to ask you about, though, is worldwide, we look at this. I mean, you talked about Russia, you touched on it. I have some interest in Ukraine. It's very fertile soil, hasn't been fully developed, but this seems to be regional from my reading of history. It's not going to hit everywhere at the same time. One season may be good in Russia, while the season in the U.S. may be bad, vice versa, like you alluded to Australia. Can you speak to that? So, I mean, it's not like the whole world's just going to freeze up like one of these Hollywood movies. It's going to be up and down and very, to your point, volatile.
Yeah, I mean, generally speaking, we're going to have more unfavorable weather in more places more of the time, but it's not going to be everyone all the time, every single season. Every once in a while, you're going to have a good growing season. I don't want anyone to think that everything is all the time everywhere. It doesn't work that way. It's a general period of increased weather volatility, a general period of worse weather, but it begs to the question of this just-in-time inventory system that you just talked about. That while weather is good and we continue to have these record crops, we can keep a just-in-time inventory system. But the minute that you get one crack in that capability, and all of a sudden those that don't have enough food, are scrambling, because the stockpiling strategy, that the year of food, having a year and a half on food on hand of critical supplies that we used to have 20 years ago, does not exist anymore. So for a perfect example, India banned rice exports just recently because they're concerned that they may not have enough rice, because now that they've shut their country down, they may not have enough pickers to go get the rice, to go get the wheat, the distribution, the weather, everything is becoming an issue now. And they're saying, wait a minute, we need that rice on hand because we don't have the stockpile that we used to have a long, long time ago. So this whole preamble, this trailer, as you put it, of the virus has exposed the folly that the just-in-time inventory system is durable and sustainable in anything other than a perfect weather environment that we were in. And so very much, this has woken everybody up. The problem is there's not enough time to make the changes that are required, because from what we see going into La Nina, the first La Nina in this grand solar cycle in 2021-22, Mother Nature is not going to let the world off the hook by having this just-in-time inventory system get ruptured. We're not going to have time to adjust. We're going to parlay into the real movie, the headline movie that we just saw the preamble to. And that's what I'm worried about, is now that people realize the vulnerability of our system, we don't have enough time to do something about it when we could have had more time to do about it 10 years ago or 5 years ago. But no one was paying attention to it back then, because no one ever does anything unless there's a crisis. Unfortunately, our world operates in a crisis reactionary mode, not a preemptive mode, unfortunately. So.
Yes, absolutely. So I've had you on now for, I don't want to go too long. You agreed to about an hour or so, but I really appreciate you coming on. Is there anything else that we didn't cover that you would like to talk about? Or, I mean, I know you're passionate about, I don't want to say warning people, but at least educating people so that they kind of understand what's actually happening or is going to happen. And like I said, you're not some guy that some crackpot on the internet. You've done the research. You make your living by forecasting, and not just for speculators like myself, real hedgers, farmers, people that are in the farming business rely on you to do this work and to be accurate. And so, kudos to you on that. You have a product. I'm going to subscribe to it and take a subscription to it. But if you'd like to talk about that a little bit about, I think it's a bi-monthly. I was really intrigued by it because I want to test it out and look at your what's happening. Because I mean, I'll always find a way to. I'm a speculator by nature, even if I don't do futures, I'll find a way
Sure,
to
sure.
profit. But if you want to talk a little bit about that or anything else that you feel is important that we may have missed, because we could talk for hours about this, but that's not within the
Well,
realm of
I would,
possibility.
if we're just talking about, I mean, I do have a agricultural service. It's a weekly report actually that goes over all the grain markets, all the soft ag markets like coffee and sugar and orange juice and cotton, that sort of thing, and all the livestock markets, milk, cattle, hogs, that sort of thing. It goes over our smart money work, our weather cycle work, and kind of makes overall recommendations of where we think prices are going. Um, you know, that's a great report for anyone that just wants to kind of get into the flow of what's going on in agriculture. The other thing that they might want to consider, John, is I know you saw some Real Vision, but I mean, we put out a report in December that really went over all of this um, in more detail. I mean, there's only so much we could talk about in an interview like this, and we don't want to get too detailed and minutia of jet stream, and there's a lot of things that we could talk about. But we put a pretty good report out that goes over this entire concept a little more detail, a little more granularly, a lot of charts, a lot of data. You know, that might be a report that some of your listeners might want to just take a look at. And I'd be more than happy to send it to them, for nothing, for free, just if they just want to get a copy of that report that would take what we've talked about here. But if they're really interested in going deeper into it, I think that's a great place for them to start, and then they can take it from there or leave it at that. But I mean, I think I have found that people that have a great interest in this, like you and others, that's a great report to delve further into, and then you can decide whether or not agricultural commodities and prices and as an investment class is for you or not. But I think that's a great place to get further into it than we're able to do on a 1 hour interview and not knowing exactly who we're talking to on this program. You just don't want to lose somebody getting too technical, So.
Absolutely. So they can. You have your website for your firm. I'll put a link to it. Hackett Financial Advisors. They can email. I think there's a link there. They can email and
Well,
request this
actually,
report.
the way we're actually have it set up right now, John, is that if they actually go to our website and download a sample report, the sample report is that report.
Okay, outstanding. I'll put a link right to that then. That won't be a problem.
If you go on the homepage, it says sample report on the. If they download that report, that is our natural weather cycle report that I think they and they can look at it at their leisure for free. That's the best way to do that, I think. So.
One thing I would encourage people to do, because a lot of people are visual and they like to be entertained too. The BBC, what got me into this big time was studying. There's a reason why Greenland's called Greenland, and there was a BBC documentary, archaeological study about what happened to the Norsemen and what happened to Eric the Red and why that place existed, and that they actually grew grain there, had fodder animals, had colonies there, and then they had, as the weather changed and the longboats could no longer make it from Denmark and Norway and these places, they came back 5 years later, and the civilization was gone. The colonies were abandoned. The Inuits people didn't know where they were, and then they looked at the dumps. I just find this interesting. I think people would find this interesting. They look at their dumps and they could see the transition about how they ran out of their sheep and their cattle. They were forced into whaling and eating seals. And then they had to bring the animals inside because the seasons were so short. And it's just the civilization collapsed, basically. I'm not suggesting that's going to happen here, but I think it's instructive that people understand the history. There were winemaking regions in the upper UK. You can track the rise and fall of empires of Egypt and Rome. They were all basically flourishing during these periods of when they happened to be in a period of excellent growing conditions where people could be fed. So I think it's you can really deep dive this. And like I said, I've taken the opportunity to overlay historical things with these cycles, and just studying about the Dalton minimum or even the Maunder minimum, which was one of the more recent ones, and some of the you can find books on this in people's diaries and what was going on during that time. It wasn't mass starvation, but life was not easy either. So some places there was starvation.
I'm sure your research I'm sure your research brought up the idea that most of the dynasties in China fell during these periods of slow solar activity and food
Absolutely.
shortages. I mean, it's fascinating. What just fascinating all the rich history that was formulated around these periods of good and bad weather and good growing conditions and bad growing conditions. It's all there, and it's and a lot's been written and a lot's been studied and a lot has been printed. It's just that no one uh, seems to be wanting to go back and actually look at the history of what actually has historically happened. It's an interesting thing about humans. We only know what we know today and yesterday, but we don't tend to learn from history. We just seem to repeat the same mistakes over and over again for whatever reason. I wish we knew why. So,
Absolutely, and I think that's a good end to our conversation. Shawn, like I said, fascinating conversation. Very interesting. I hope people get a lot out of this. I really appreciate your time. I know it's you're on the East Coast. It's getting a little bit late, but I definitely appreciate your time, and I think people are going to find this conversation very interesting. And like I said, I'll put a link to that report. You being generous and offering that. And I hope people will avail themselves of that. So with that, I'd like to say thanks again. And if you have any parting thoughts, otherwise, that's we're at our end.
well, John, I just want to say thank you so much. I mean, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. It's always an honor to share views, and it really means a lot to me to reach out, and I just want to thank you for the forum. You're doing great work for many people, and I appreciate that. So,
All right. Thank you very much, sir. With that, I'll wish you good night, and I hope we'll talk in the future.
sounds good. Thanks. Have a good night.
You too. Bye now.